They stole my boat from my own lake and threatened to fine me if I dared fight back. They had no idea who I was or what I owned. I'm a retired engineer, just trying to live quietly on land my grandfather bought 70 years ago. But when the HOA tried to claim it as theirs, let me take you back to the day everything changed. And tell me, has anyone ever tried to bully you off your own property when I left the chaos of Silicon Valley behind? I wasn't searching for revenge, justice, or even clarity. I was searching for silence. And that's exactly what I thought I'd found here at the edge of Greystone Lake, in the old wooden cabin my grandfather built with his bare hands. I'm David Brooks, 42, former software engineer, early retiree, burned out and done playing the corporate game. A few months ago, I traded boardrooms and quarterly reports for pine trees and loons echoing across still water. I'd inherited the cabin after my mother passed, and I figured there was no better time to reconnect with nature, with memory, and maybe with myself. The mornings here had become sacred strong coffee, flannel robe, barefoot steps on dew-covered planks. That particular morning started no differently until I saw it. A garish sheet of neon orange paper slapped against the side of my grandfather's fishing boat. Waterproof tape, bold black lettering, violation notice. I peeled it off slowly, more curious than concerned. The language inside was stunning in its arrogance. You are hereby ordered to remove your unauthorized watercraft from community waters within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in a $500 fine per day, and your boat may be towed and impounded at your expense. This notice has been issued in accordance with the Greystone Lakeside HOA aesthetic guidelines and water usage policies. It took me a few seconds to process it. Then I laughed. Not a gentle chuckle, no. This was a bitter, incredulous kind of laugh. The kind that escapes when you're reading something so detached from reality. It could only have been written by someone drunk on power and totally unaware of their own ignorance. My boat. On my lake. Greystone Lake has belonged to the Brooks family for nearly 70 years. My grandfather bought the lake and surrounding land back in the 50s when it was nothing but forest and farmland. His fishing boat, still moored to the same handmade dock, wasn't just property, it was legacy. And now some self-important HOA committee thought they could bully me off of it. They had no idea who they were dealing with, still holding the notice. I marched back to the cabin and called the only person in the area I trusted, Leo Harmon, a retired stonemason in his late 70s. Leo had lived a few coves over since before I was born. When he picked up, I barely had to explain. "Ah, they finally found you," he muttered, his voice like worn gravel. "Welcome to the circus. Those HOA folks have been poking their noses where they don't belong for years now. You're not the first, but you might be the first who actually owns the damn lake." I froze. Wait, you mean they've been using it like it's theirs? Fishing tournaments, fancy parties. They even call it a community asset now. Your granddad would have sent them running with a slingshot and a sermon. I didn't laugh this time, because I wasn't amused anymore. I was just getting started. Leo's words echoed in my mind long after I ended the call. They even call it a community asset now. As if memories could be rebranded. As if history could be overwritten by a well-printed brochure. I stood at the edge of the dock, the orange violation notice crumpled in my hand, and stared out at the still waters of Greystone Lake, my lake. But it wasn't just mine in the legal sense. It ran deeper than that. It was blood, memory, legacy. My grandfather, Walter Granger, was never a man of many words. He spoke through action, through weathered hands, through rows of firewood chopped before winter, through nets mended by candlelight. He wasn't just the man who raised my mother. He was the one who raised the lake. In 1954, when most people saw northern Michigan as little more than wilderness, he saw potential, not for profit, not for development, but for peace, for protection. After retiring early from a life in the merchant marine, he purchased 80 acres of wooded land that wrapped around a secluded, mirror-like lake. That lake would become Greystone. He built the cabin himself, using salvaged timber from an old railway depot and stone he hauled by hand from the nearby creek bed. No one helped him. He didn't ask. He once told me, "If you build it with your own hands, you'll never take it for granted." And he didn't. I was 6 the first summer he let me stay with him. My parents, both teachers, had a workshop in Chicago and needed someone to look after me. I remember being terrified of the dark woods and the utter absence of street noise, but he had a way of making the silence feel safe. Every morning, we'd rise before the sun. He'd hand me a cup of weak coffee he called starter brew, and we'd walk barefoot to the end of the dock. He'd push off with one oar, and we'd drift out into the center of the lake. Just the two of us. The world was smaller there, simpler. It was where I first learned how to bait a hook, how to sit still, and more importantly, how to listen. He told stories in fragments about the mining company that once tried to buy the land, about the slick men in suits who offered him a fortune if he'd allow them to drain and re-engineer the watershed to run equipment. He turned them down flat. They came back with lawyers. He met them with research, environmental law, and local alliances. And when that failed, he went door to door with petitions, got the township to designate the lake as a private natural reserve under his care. There are things worth more than money, he'd say, gripping the oar with a hand knotted by decades of labor. Water's one of them. It doesn't belong to anyone, but someone's got to look after it. Years passed. The world changed. Developers moved in. Trees became asphalt. But Walter never left. And the lake never changed, not for him. When I was 17, my mom brought me back for one last summer before college. That was the year Walter built the observation bench on the North Ridge. Not every problem is a nail, he told me, hammer still in hand. Sometimes you solve things just by watching. I didn't understand then. I do now. Walter passed away when I was in grad school, 94, quietly, alone in his chair facing the lake. I didn't make it in time to say goodbye, but in truth, he'd said all he needed to long before. The land passed to my mother, though she rarely visited. The lake reminded her too much of him. I think, after she died 2 years ago, I became the sole heir. I inherited not just the deed, but everything he built: the cabin, the shoreline, the quiet, but I left it untouched, too busy chasing deadlines, funding rounds, and high-rise dreams. For 5 years, the cabin sat closed, the dock weathered, the water undisturbed. I told myself I'd return someday. Someday came after my company was acquired by a larger firm, after I walked away from the acquisition table with more money than I knew what to do with, and the distinct feeling that none of it mattered. I didn't know it then, but I was searching for Walter, for stillness, for the thing that the city could never give me. I arrived in early spring, the air still cold enough to bite. The cabin was musty, the shutters stiff with age, but it still stood strong. I began cleaning room by room, stripped the mold from the stone hearth, replaced the pipes and sealed the roof, but I left the carved initials on the old pantry door, W.G., 1957. I kept the boat just as it was dented, dull with time, the motor still functional but barely. It didn't need to be fast. It just needed to float. The same way it had floated me and my grandfather into those misty mornings all those years ago. By summer, I'd found rhythm again, mornings on the water, afternoons fixing things, evenings with a journal and a drink. My neighbors left me alone. The animals didn't. I welcomed both. I thought the silence would be permanent. I wanted it to be, until the orange notice arrived. That crumpled paper on the boat wasn't just an offense to property, it was an offense to history. It spat in the face of every sacrifice my grandfather made to protect this place. It dismissed the decades of stewardship, the water-tested values, the quiet resistance to greed. And so, I unfolded the property documents, now faded with age but still crystal clear in their boundaries. Every inch of shoreline, every acre of water, every clause and right-of-way. Walter Granger didn't just leave me a cabin, he left me a map. And now, I knew exactly where it led. I stared at the folded deed on the table, its edges worn and corners soft from decades of handling. Walter's signature stared back at me steady, proud, deliberate. The lake was mine, not metaphorically, not sentimentally, legally, undeniably. And yet someone had dared to act like it belonged to them. That orange violation notice had poked a sleeping bear, and now I was wide awake. I wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions without evidence. Years in tech taught me the value of hard proof, digital trails, data. So I did what any ex-programmer with a suspicious mind and too much time would do. I opened my laptop and started digging. It didn't take long. The name Greystone Lakeside Homeowners Association brought up a sleek website with stock photos of smiling families, trimmed hedges, and golden retrievers in perfectly manicured front yards. But buried in the events calendar was something else entirely, a section called Elite Anglers Club. I clicked and stared. Full-color images loaded slowly over my rural Wi-Fi, but each one stabbed deeper. Dozens of photos from past fishing tournaments, tables of catered food, fancy pop-up tents, even a logo crest-shaped, embroidered on fishing vests and hats. The Greystone Elite Anglers. Apparently, they had been holding their annual Lakeside Championship for over a decade. The background of every photo was unmistakable, the sloping eastern shore of Greystone Lake. My grandfather's shore, my property. One image showed a temporary dock, clearly not the original one Walter built. It jutted crudely into the water like a scar. In another, I spotted the hill behind my cabin in the distance. The realization hit me like ice water down the spine. They hadn't just been trespassing. They'd been profiting, hosting large-scale publicized events on my land, without permission, without shame. Anger stirred again, but this time it was colder, more focused. I needed help, and I knew exactly who to call. Rachel Klein and I had met our sophomore year at Carnegie Mellon. While I was coding in basements for startup internships, she was knee-deep in environmental law debates and campus protests against fracking. We'd stayed in touch sporadically, birthdays, Christmas messages, but the moment I explained the situation, her tone changed completely. "You own the water rights?" she asked sharply. "Yes. And the shoreline too. And they're threatening you for having a boat on it." I heard her scoff through the line. "That's not just bold, it's criminal." Rachel didn't mince words. She told me this wasn't just a simple property dispute. It was a full-blown trespass case, possibly even a fraud case, depending on what the HOA had told its members. "Document everything," she said. "Don't confront them yet. They'll start covering tracks the second they realize you're not ignorant." I promised her I'd get proof. That afternoon, I drove into town and bought 4 discrete motion-activated trail cameras, the kind hunters use to track deer. I installed them at key points along the shoreline, the eastern dock where the tournaments seemed to happen, a clearing near the barbecue pit I recognized from the photos, and 2 others near the trails leading in from the Greystone subdivision. They were nearly invisible, camouflaged, silent, infrared ready. They'd send alerts to my phone the second someone approached. While the cameras uploaded their test footage, I rummaged through the storage chest under the cabin floor and pulled out an old filing case labeled Greystone Land. Legal, inside deeds, tax assessments, letters from the county water board, even a topographic survey my mother had paid for back in 2009. The lines were clear, and so were the words "parcel includes entirety of Greystone Lake" and "land extending 20 feet from high water mark." There it was, undeniable. The land, the lake, the water itself, it was all mine. Had been for 70 years. I scanned everything into my laptop and sent digital copies to Rachel. A few minutes later, she texted back, "This is solid gold, ironclad. They have zero legal footing. I'm coming up this weekend." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch with the old oil lantern lit beside me, staring out across the moonlit water. The trees whispered in the wind, and the loons cried far off. For a moment, I could almost see Walter sitting at the end of the dock, legs dangling, fishing rod in hand, shaking his head. He'd have gone down there with a shotgun, but this wasn't his era. This was mine. And in my world, we fought with paper trails, not pellets. The next morning, the first alert came through. Motion on the eastern dock. I opened the camera feed and saw two men wheeling coolers and rods down to the water's edge. One wore a vest with the elite angler's patch. The other, sunglasses and a clipboard. This wasn't recreation. This was preparation. I cross-referenced the HOA's website. Sure enough, their next big tournament, the 14th Annual Greystone Championship, was scheduled for the upcoming Saturday with a $5,000 grand prize. Sponsored by a local fishing equipment brand, they were going all in, and they were doing it on stolen ground. I printed out every page, screenshot every image, logged every timestamp. It wasn't just about keeping records. It was about building a case strong enough to burn down a lie. Rachel called that evening with more news. I checked the HOA's incorporation filings. She said, they never had rights to manage the lake, not even implied ones. They've been misleading their residents, possibly even committing fraud. Why would they do that, I asked. She hesitated. Because they're planning something bigger. Trust me, they're not just greedy. They're preparing for a land grab. I didn't like the sound of that. But now, I wasn't just some recluse in a lakeside cabin. I was the rightful owner. And I was watching. Rachel was right. This wasn't just about fishing tournaments. It was about control. And I had every reason to believe the HOA had plans that stretched far beyond a few impromptu barbecues. So when I received a generic email inviting all residents to the next Greystone HOA monthly meeting, I didn't hesitate. I had no intention of making a scene. Not yet. I just wanted to see them put faces to the names behind the threats, the arrogance, the theft, and maybe, if the opportunity presented itself, ask one simple question that would set their whole illusion ablaze. The meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m. on a Thursday evening at the Greystone Lakeside Community Center. The building itself was almost cartoonishly pompous Roman columns, fake brick facade, and a circular driveway filled with SUVs and sedans that hadn't seen dirt roads in years. As I parked my truck at the far end of the lot, I saw clusters of residents already heading inside, most of them dressed like they were attending a country club mixer, not a neighborhood policy meeting. I took a seat in the back row of the community hall. About 30 people were already seated, chatting quietly, clutching reusable coffee cups or HOA-issued pamphlets. The room smelled faintly of potpourri and printer toner. At exactly 6:02, the double doors opened, and in walked the man himself, Walter Reeves, president of the Greystone Lakeside HOA. He was every bit the caricature Rachel and I had imagined mid-50s. Silver hair combed like a campaign ad, blue blazer with gold buttons, polished loafers that had never touched shoreline mud. His face wore a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He walked with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed, flanked by two others I'd later identify as Karen Dempsey, vice president, and Lionel Paxton, the HOA's legal advisor. Karen had the look of someone who hadn't heard the word no in decades. Lionel had the look of someone who made sure she didn't have to. Walter called the meeting to order with the kind of ceremonial self-importance usually reserved for courtrooms or stage plays. He moved swiftly through mundane updates, lawn height violations, trash bin placement regulations, and a motion to repaint the community mailbox kiosk. It was all a carefully constructed lull, boring enough to discourage dissent, but polished enough to suggest order. Then came the agenda item I'd been waiting for. And now, Walter said, his tone shifting, we must address an issue that threatens the aesthetic and environmental harmony of our community, the presence of unauthorized watercraft on Greystone Lake. The phrase itself was laughable. Unauthorized watercraft. He said it like he was talking about a nuclear submarine. Walter went on, all residents are reminded that per Article 7 of our Community Harmony Code, all vessels must be registered with the HOA and adhere to established appearance standards. No exceptions. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I raised my hand. There was a noticeable ripple through the room. Walter's eyes flicked toward me, narrowing just slightly. Yes, the gentleman in the back, he said, trying to sound welcoming. He failed. I stood slowly, keeping my voice neutral. I was just wondering, when you say community waters, what exactly does that mean? Who owns Greystone Lake? The question sucked the air right out of the room. For a beat, Walter didn't respond. Karen and Lionel exchanged a glance. Then he smiled again, tighter this time. The lake is a shared resource, managed by the HOA for the benefit of all residents, he said smoothly. It's been that way since the Greystone subdivision was developed. I nodded slowly. So, the HOA holds the deed to the lake. Another pause, another glance between Karen and Lionel. There are long-standing historical agreements in place, Walter replied, which empower the HOA to enforce regulations and maintain community standards. That's interesting, I said, keeping my tone light, because the county recorder's office lists the lake as private property owned entirely by the Brooks family since 1954. Would those historical agreements happen to override legal title? A murmur spread across the room like wildfire. People turned in their seats. Some leaned forward. I saw one man in a Greystone angler's vest shift uncomfortably. Walter's jaw clenched. This is not the time or place to debate property lines, he said, trying to recover. This meeting is for administrative matters. Understood, I said calmly, sitting back down. Just thought I'd ask. He moved on, rattling through the rest of the agenda at twice the previous speed, his voice now slightly tremulous at the edges. But the spell had been broken. People weren't nodding politely anymore. They were whispering, glancing toward me, toward each other, toward the lake they had all assumed belonged to someone else. After the meeting, as the room emptied, I hung back and loitered near the coffee urn, pretending to stir sugar into a cup. That's when I heard them, Walter, Karen, and Lionel clustered near the window by the refreshment table. We need to accelerate the timeline, Karen was saying, low and urgent. If he's here asking questions, the whole plan could unravel. Brooks wasn't supposed to be part of this, Lionel muttered. We need to deal with it. Now. I'll talk to Gerald, Walter said. We'll push the board, finalize before this gets out of hand. I didn't catch the rest. They moved away quickly, heads bowed, voices hushed. But it was enough. They weren't just issuing bogus violation notices. They weren't just trespassing. They were orchestrating something bigger, something with a timeline. And clearly, my unexpected presence and my questions had thrown a wrench in it. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I realized the performance was over. The mask had cracked, and I wasn't watching anymore. I was in the play now. The mask had cracked, and I wasn't watching anymore. I was in the play now. That thought stayed with me as I drove back from the HOA meeting, headlights slicing through pine-lined roads, a steady tension tightening around my spine. I didn't know what their timeline was, but they'd made one thing clear: I was a problem they hadn't planned for. And the next morning, they made their first move. It started with the silence. Every day since returning to the cabin, I'd begun my mornings with coffee on the dock, staring out across the lake, my grandfather's old fishing boat bobbing gently in the water like a memory anchored in place. But when I stepped outside that morning, coffee steaming in my hand, boots crunching gravel, I saw only water. The boat was gone. No rope, no oar, just an empty slip, gently lapping against the side of the dock like nothing had ever been there. My first instinct wasn't panic, it was disbelief. I thought maybe it had drifted. Maybe someone borrowed it and would return it with a note. But then I spotted something bright pinned to the dock piling. Another notice. This one wasn't orange. It was white, official looking, and laminated. Notice of enforcement action. Unauthorized vessel removed, pursuant to Community Standards Regulation 12.4a. Property deemed non-compliant, vessel impounded and may be reclaimed upon payment of $750 fine and submission of a compliance agreement. At the bottom, a signature in bold black ink, Walter Reeves, President, Greystone Lakeside HOA. The blood drained from my face, not because of the money but because of what this meant. They thought they could erase me, erase my family's history, just haul away what was mine, like it was junk left in the wrong driveway. I stormed back to the cabin, pulled out my phone, and dialed the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher transferred me to a deputy named Hawkins. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. Private property, stolen vessel, forged authority. There was a pause. Then, with the kind of voice that's been coached through a dozen HOA conflicts, he said, "Mr. Brooks, this sounds like a civil dispute. If the HOA impounded the vessel under their posted regulations, there may be grounds for mediation, I snapped. They took my boat off my private lake. There is no community water. This is theft. I understand your frustration, sir," Hawkins replied. "But in these cases, we're often advised to let the parties resolve matters through legal counsel." In other words, they weren't going to help, and that's when something in me hardened. Something that had been quiet for too long. When you grow up watching a man like Walter Granger who stood his ground with words, laws, and if necessary, a 12 gauge, you learn that some lines aren't meant to be crossed, and when they are, you don't back down. You dig in. By the time Rachel arrived 2 hours later, I was pacing the dock like a general on the edge of a battlefield. She took one look at the notice and muttered, "They're escalating. Fast." We brought every box of documentation inside and spread them across the dining table: deeds, maps, survey reports, zoning statements, even handwritten notes from Walter's legal correspondence. Rachel worked like a machine, highlighting, flagging, cross-referencing with digital archives she pulled from the county website. An hour in, she looked up and said, "I found it." She slid a paper across to me, a scanned development plan from 2003, the original proposal for the Greystone Lakeside subdivision. There, in black and white exclusion, Greystone Lake and its surrounding parcels remain under private ownership and are not subject to HOA jurisdiction. Refer to county file Notre GL 1 for deed-specific boundaries. I read it twice to be sure. My hands trembled not with doubt, but with fury. "They knew," I said quietly. "They knew from the beginning." Rachel nodded. "They've been hoping the truth stayed buried under bureaucracy. And I realized this wasn't just about a boat or even trespassing anymore. This was about a coordinated attempt to rewrite ownership, to slowly seize control through repetition, presence, and false authority. It was a land grab dressed in community language, and they were getting away with it because no one had ever pushed back." Rachel leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You said there's a fishing tournament next weekend, 14th annual. I said, big prize, sponsors, barbecue. They even put up a temporary dock on the east shore." Her eyes lit up. "Perfect. We let them go through with it." I blinked. "You want to let them trespass again? We document them trespassing again, with participants, with signage, with financial transactions. The more they do on your land without consent, the stronger our case gets. Let them think you've gone quiet. Let them get comfortable." I nodded, feeling the plan unfold in real time. "But until then," she added, "we need to stay invisible. No arguments, no retaliation, and definitely don't sign anything they send you." That evening, we went down to the dock where my boat had once been. The water was calm, unbothered by the conflict brewing above it. I stood there for a long time, imagining Walter beside me, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the horizon. "They want to fight," I said aloud. "So we give them one, but not the kind they expect, the kind they can't win, with paperwork, with cameras, with truth. Because the difference between a thief and a steward is simple. A thief takes in silence. A steward waits and then takes everything back." Walter thought I'd disappear after the boat, that I'd cave, or maybe just go quiet. But when my silence lasted more than a few days, it must have unsettled him. because exactly 5 days after the theft, he showed up on my front porch, smiling like we were old friends. It was just past 9. I was at the cabin's kitchen table, reviewing security footage from the eastern shoreline, where a few HOA members had already begun setting up equipment in preparation for the upcoming tournament. I heard tires on gravel, followed by a car door, and then the knock. When I opened the door, there he stood, Walter Reeves, dressed down in a crisp button-up and khaki slacks, sleeves rolled as if he were a man of the people. His SUV idled behind him. Gone was the smug poise from the meeting. In its place, a carefully curated posture of diplomacy. "Mr. Brooks," he said, extending a hand I didn't shake. "Glad to finally connect. May I come in? I didn't move." "What do you want? I think we got off on the wrong foot," he said smoothly, undeterred by my coldness. "There's been some confusion regarding the lake, and I thought perhaps we could resolve it like neighbors, not adversaries." Still blocking the doorway, I tilted my head. "You stole my boat, Walter." His smile twitched but didn't vanish. "That was a regrettable enforcement decision. Perhaps a bit premature. I'm here to offer a path forward." I let him in not out of courtesy, but curiosity. Predators only expose their fangs when they think they are about to eat. Inside, Walter feigned admiration of the cabin's rustic charm, commenting on the woodwork, the view, the old family photographs I kept near the mantel. He eventually eased himself onto my couch and pulled a single-page document from a leather folder. "This," he said, placing it on the coffee table, "is a simple agreement. Nothing binding long-term. It merely acknowledges the HOA's ongoing role in managing lake activities purely for liability and coordination purposes." I read it once, then again. It was poison dressed as tea. The document stated that in exchange for leniency regarding past violations, I would recognize the HOA's authority to regulate access, usage, and aesthetic standards on Greystone Lake consistent with community tradition. They wanted legal acknowledgement of rights they never had wrapped in the language of compromise. I looked up, feigning confusion. "And this would let me keep my boat?" Walter nodded. "No more fines. No more misunderstandings. We just want to move forward cooperatively." "And the fishing tournament this Saturday?" I asked innocently. "That's covered under this too." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "You know about that?" "Someone mentioned it," I said with a shrug. "Sounds like a big deal." Walter hesitated. "It's tradition, part of our community's character. Sponsors are involved. It's important we keep things harmonious. And this development, I've heard whispers about the one involving lakefront property and investors." The mask slipped, just for a breath. His eyes narrowed before he smoothed his face over. "I'm not sure where you heard that, but even if something were being considered, this agreement has nothing to do with it." "Of course," I said, handing the paper back, "but I'll need my lawyer to review it." His lips pressed into a tight line. "Naturally. Just don't wait too long. There's opportunity here, Mr. Brooks, for both of us." He left with that dangling carrot hanging in the air, unaware it had already rotted. As soon as his SUV vanished down the dirt road, I called Rachel. "He's nervous." I said. "Offered a deal, admitted they've got investors, called the tournament important. He's losing control," Rachel replied. "That's when people get sloppy. Let's tighten the timeline." We finalized the plan that night. Step 1, Rachel prepared an emergency injunction. We weren't filing it yet. We needed the trespass to happen first, in real time, under our terms. Step 2, I signed a contract with a local private security firm, a team of 3, licensed and experienced with property enforcement. They would deploy immediately after the tournament concluded, armed with documentation and signage to cordon off the perimeter. Step 3, we mapped out coverage points for our surveillance equipment, drones, telephoto lenses, hidden wildlife cameras. We weren't just watching, we were documenting. Time-stamped, cataloged, legal grade. Saturday arrived under a bright June sky, clear, windless, almost mocking in its calm. From my porch, I could already hear the engines rumbling by 7 a.m. Trucks began arriving in waves, many with trailers hauling boats outfitted in carbon fiber, painted logos, and high-end gear. They parked along the eastern shoreline, my land, and began unloading. Tents popped up. Tables unfolded. Generators buzzed to life as someone fired up a loudspeaker playing soft country music. A banner unfurled between two poles, the 15th annual Greystone Elite Anglers Championship. It was so absurd I nearly laughed. From our vantage point hidden in the tree line above the ridge, Rachel and I began recording. We logged every setup, every grill, every footstep on private land. At 11:23 a.m., Walter arrived this time in a navy blazer and tan slacks, accompanied by a small group of people in suits. One carried a folder thick with glossy renderings. Another wore sunglasses and held an iPad, swiping through what appeared to be schematics. "Investors," Rachel whispered, raising her camera. "He's doing the pitch. Right here." We crept closer, concealed by trees, and caught audio on a directional mic prime location. Private feeling lake, long-standing community usage. Just one parcel we're finalizing. He gestured across my land like he owned it. When one of the investors asked about holdouts, Walter replied, "Just one family property. He's cooperating. Just a matter of time." I felt something twist in my gut. Not rage, not fear. Resolve. He wasn't just bluffing. He was lying with the confidence of a man who thought no one could challenge him. But he was wrong. Because every word, every handshake, every photo, every anchor thrown into my lake was being recorded. And when we struck back, it wouldn't be loud. It would be irrefutable. He gestured across my land like he owned it. But by the end of that day, everyone would know just how wrong he was. The moment Walter uttered the words, "He's cooperating," Rachel and I exchanged a glance. That was the final nail. It was time. We left the ridge quietly, with hours of video and audio recordings, still photos, drone footage, timestamps, and GPS-tagged coordinates, all cross-referenced with our property line documentation. Rachel made the call from my cabin. Her voice was calm, crisp, deliberate. "Your Honor, we're filing for an emergency injunction. Private property is being used without the owner's consent documented, recorded, and ongoing." We drove straight to the county courthouse with our case file in hand, thick, organized, and damning. Within 2 hours, we were standing in front of Judge Ainsley Harmon, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, known for siding with facts, not theatrics. Rachel presented the deed, first full legal ownership of Greystone Lake and the adjacent shoreline, recorded, uncontested. Then came the visual proof, photo after photo of trespass, commercial use, construction without permit. The judge's brow furrowed deeper with every page turned. And finally, the kicker, a recorded statement from Walter Reeves himself, pitching the land as if it were his to sell. Her decision was swift. Injunction granted. Judge Harmon said, effective immediately. No further use or occupation of the property by the Greystone Lakeside Homeowners Association or affiliated parties without express, written consent of the legal owner. We left with an official court order, stamped and signed. Rachel smiled for the first time in days. "Let's go clear out your lake." We didn't go alone. By the time we returned to the shoreline, the tournament was in full swing. The smell of grilled meat and sunscreen hung thick in the air. Kids ran between tents. Music blared from portable speakers. Boats dotted the water like careless ornaments. But behind us, a marked sheriff's vehicle. Lights off, but presence unmistakable. 2 uniformed deputies flanked us. The private security team waited near the access path with signs in hand. Private property, trespassing prohibited. By court order, I stepped forward as the lead deputy raised his voice over a megaphone. "Attention, everyone. This event is taking place on private property without legal authorization. We have a court injunction mandating the immediate cessation of all activities. You are required to vacate the premises." At first, the crowd froze in disbelief. Then chaos. Voices rose. Someone dropped a drink. A man in a fishing vest shouted, "What do you mean, private? We've used this lake for years." Rachel stepped forward, holding up the court order. "My name is Rachel Klein, legal counsel for Mr. Brooks, the legal owner of Greystone Lake and its shoreline. The HOA has no documented rights to this property. Anyone remaining here is now in violation of a direct judicial order." Walter appeared within seconds, practically charging through the crowd, his face pale and contorted with disbelief. "This is absurd," he barked. "This lake has been under community management for over a decade." Rachel handed him a copy of the injunction and said, firmly, "That is demonstrably false, and we have evidence of you misrepresenting ownership to investors, which could be construed as fraud." Around us, people began packing up in a mixture of confusion, anger, and dawning realization. A few residents argued with each other. Some stood in a stunned silence, holding rods mid-cast. Others simply watched the unraveling of a lie they'd accepted without question. One man, a resident, I guessed, stepped toward me. "We've been paying HOA dues for lake upkeep. Where's that money been going?" His voice was louder than the others, and it triggered a ripple through the crowd. Nods, whispers, murmurs of agreement. Walter was losing them. He tried to recover, turning to the investors standing off to the side, their portfolios tucked awkwardly under their arms. "We can resolve this. It's a temporary legal miscommunication." But the woman in the navy pantsuit shook her head. "We were told this land was already secured." Her eyes narrowed. "This is misrepresentation. We're done." And just like that, they turned and walked back toward their vehicles, leaving Walter standing in a collapsing empire. I stepped closer to him, calm, unshaken. "I have recordings of you, Walter," I said, "offering land you don't own, saying I was cooperating, telling investors it was a done deal." His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "This game you're playing," I said, holding up my phone, "it's over." He didn't respond, just stood there, as one of the deputies began repeating the order for all attendees to vacate. The signs went up, the tents came down, and slowly, shamefully, the entire event folded. By sundown, the lakeshore was empty again, except for me, Rachel, and the deputies still watching over the last of the gear being loaded onto trailers. We stood in silence as the final boat was wheeled up the gravel path. Then I turned to Rachel. "That was satisfying." She smiled, weary but victorious, and long overdue. I walked back down to the dock and stood where the boat used to be, where the water stretched out. Calm again, untouched by lies. They had tried to take what wasn't theirs, but now every inch of it was reclaimed, legally, publicly, permanently. Walter may have built a stage of illusion, but I had burned it to the ground, and all that was left was truth. The shoreline was quiet again. After weeks of tension, trespass, and threats disguised as policy, it was over. The false power they clung to had collapsed under the weight of truth, and now only the lake remained, as still and sovereign as it had always been. The next morning, the headlines came fast. HOA exposed for false claims over. Private lake local developer, implicated in land scheme court. Ruling confirms Greystone Lake is privately owned, but none captured the full weight of what happened. That came in the form of people residents showing up at my cabin not to confront, but to apologize. Not to argue, but to ask questions. They'd been told lies for years, and now that those lies had unraveled in front of them, they were left looking for something real to rebuild on. Sarah Lynn, the local reporter I'd trusted with the truth, ran a full feature that Sunday. Her piece included scanned property deeds, direct quotes from the court injunction, and most importantly, a timeline of Walter Reeves' private dealings. Within 48 hours, the article had been shared across state forums and HOA watchdog groups, and then someone dug deeper. It turned out Walter Reeves wasn't his first name, or second. His real name was Mitchell Decker, a disgraced real estate broker who'd lost his license in Florida years ago for misrepresenting property lines in a retirement development scandal. He changed his name, relocated, and slipped back into the same old games, only this time. He thought no one would look too closely, until I did. When this information reached the county prosecutor's office, it lit a fire. Misuse of HOA funds, false representation to investors, unauthorized seizure of private property. A formal investigation was launched. Subpoenas followed. Karen Dempsey and Lionel Paxton resigned within the week. Walter or Mitchell quietly disappeared. Some said he skipped town. Others believed he'd lawyered up and was waiting out the storm. Either way, the man who once tried to sell my lake now had nowhere to stand. In his place, something better rose. The residents of Greystone Lakeside called an emergency election, and at the top of the new board was Michael Harper, a retired state judge who had quietly lived on the West Ridge for 15 years and, as it turned out, had once known my grandfather. "I fished this lake with Walter Granger in 1981, he told me, shaking my hand. He wouldn't have stood for what they did, and neither will I. Together, we formed something new, the Greystone Lake Conservation Trust. It wasn't about excluding people, it was about stewardship. We created permits for limited public access, simple, affordable, with every dollar going to environmental maintenance and shoreline repair. No more exclusive clubs, no more gated events, just clean water, quiet shores, and mutual respect. The first person to apply for a permit? The man who'd shouted during the shutdown, demanding to know where his HOA dues had gone. He stood on my dock that afternoon, hat in hand, and said simply, "I didn't know. I'm sorry. That was enough." I brought back the boat myself. It had been left, unloved and weather-stained, in a fenced lot behind the community center. But once I got it home, I spent a weekend sanding the hull, fixing the motor, and repainting the nameplate W, e.g., 1954. Walter Granger's initials, his year, that next morning. I took it out at dawn. The water was calm. The air tasted like pine and memory. I rowed slowly to the center of the lake, just as we used to, and cast a line with no expectation of catching anything. I didn't need to. Sometimes the point is simply to return. Back on shore, the changes had already begun. The eastern bank, once filled with canopies and corporate flags, was now a public green space, modest and open, with a wooden bench overlooking the water. We installed a small pier, accessible to all, and at its entrance stood a plaque in memory of Walter Granger, who believed water was not a commodity but a responsibility. Justice had been served, not with vengeance, not with noise, but with quiet certainty and legal clarity, the kind that couldn't be argued or erased. Mitchell Decker lost everything: his credibility, his investors, and the house he claimed defined the community. The county froze his accounts pending financial audits. Some rumors said he was facing criminal fraud charges. I didn't need to follow the rest of his story. I'd already written the ending I cared about. The town changed too. The HOA budget was audited and restructured. New policies were drafted, this time with resident votes and transparency. People who once ignored each other at mailbox stations now attended meetings, asked questions, volunteered to repair community spaces. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As for me, I stayed. I finished converting the old tool shed into a reading room. I built a small greenhouse near the back slope, and every so often, someone would knock asking for permission to fish, or just to talk about what happened. And I always said yes, as long as they respected the rules. Because this place, this story, wasn't about power. It was about protection. One evening, as I stood on the porch watching the sun fold into the lake, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. The kind that comes not just from winning, but from restoring. Not everything can be taken. Not everything will be bought. Sometimes the best revenge is restoring what they tried to steal. The lake is whole again, and so am I. Was I too harsh, or did they deserve it? I'd love to hear your take.